Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our fourth session of our JEDI workshop series, What is Our Own Story Concerning Race? So tonight is our fourth session. So we do want to begin this evening like we have our previous meeting. So as a sign of respect, we do wish to begin this event by acknowledging the original inhabitants of the lands in the 7 counties served by Genesee Valley Region PTA, the Onondaga people of the mountain, and the Gayacono people of the Great Swamp. Our very name Genesee is derived from the Onondagan word for pleasant bank. We sincerely thank and honor the tribal members of these 2 nations, original members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. We recognize the unique relationships these Indigenous stewards have always had with the land as partners with, not masters of, and we do recognize their meaningful and rich traditions. We also recognize and acknowledge the long history of genocide, colonization, broken treaties, and forced assimilation of Indigenous people that still takes place on this land. The Onondaga and Gayacono live here, they raise their families here, and they bury their dead here. Mindful of these histories, we work towards learning and voicing the truth of the past and the impact on the present day. As parent leaders, we understand a complete unwhitewashed telling of history aids us in being more effective advocates for all children, irrespective of ethnicity, culture, religion, color, and socioeconomic background. This knowledge sows the ground for becoming a more welcoming and inclusive and diverse organization. Finally, we encourage you to learn about Indigenous tribes, their history, and their current standing in society. And I'll talk more at the end of our evening about an opportunity that our region PTA is putting together that we would invite you to take a part in. So on behalf of the Genesee Valley Region Board, I do want to welcome everyone to this evening's workshop on what is our own story concerning race. During our first 3 sessions, we learned about implicit bias and how it affects how we perceive the world around us and how it can have a very real effect on creating explicit outcomes. We looked at the hidden reality of how many aspects of life around us are geared toward a white point of view and how that can minimize and exclude others. And last time we looked at allyship and how allyship is an action and how, according to Ann Bishop, allies are people who recognize the unearned privilege they receive from society's patterns of injustice and take responsibility for changing these patterns. PTA values collaboration, commitment, accountability, respect, inclusivity, and integrity as we work to advocate for every child with one voice. This workshop series will provide not only a brave space for us to engage in thoughtful conversation and understanding of everyone's personal story and how it can affect how we see the world, but that it can also provide a guide for how we can bring this conversation to our own communities of influence so that our PTAs can be a true advocate for all children. And so I want to welcome back Jim Puglisi for our final session tonight.
Good evening, everyone. And hopefully I am over the sneezing fit that I was just in the midst of when we started. So it can always be a hindrance to this type of stuff. So my apologies. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll kind of get started with this kind of final evening together. And let's see if I can make sure I do this all right. And can everyone see that? All right, thank you. Thank you for the thumbs up. That's helpful. So as Sonya actually already mentioned, we talk about this space being a brave space and not a safe space, that it's really, I can't create a safe space for somebody else because I don't know their full story and their full background. But we hope that it is a brave space for people to be able to look at themselves and seek to go a little bit further than where they've been before, particularly when we talk about these types of issues where it really takes an intentionality on each person and each one of us to be present and to stay present. So with that, back to the community agreements that we've been using over the past couple sessions. We ask you that you stay engaged, that you listen, and that you speak up. So again, that deep listening, hearing what people are saying, not already thinking about what your response might be or whatever. Just really listen, but also find your voice and speak up and take a risk to do that. Be vulnerable in that way. Speak your truths using I statements. We really want you speaking from your experience, from your situation, your context. This is not a national dialogue about PTA or things like that, but really what's happening in your particular area, your specific context. Be willing to be uncomfortable and just sit with that. And I would offer that when you are feeling discomfortable, make note of what is making you uncomfortable. Write that down, because that's something for you to explore later on. You know, why did something that was said or a context or whatever it is, make note of that, because it's evoking some kind of emotional response, which means, and you may not be totally sure where that's coming from. So that's a good, if you want a good place to start in this work, is making note of those types of discomforts so that you can go back and explore them later on and see what their origins are. Okay, so and I would make that a practice, and we'll actually talk about it a little bit later on. Expect and accept non-closure. This work is a continuous work, and every context is different. Every person that enters into a context changes the work, changes the dynamic of the work, and that is part of it. So particularly for white culture that really likes closure, we like to fix things and finish things. That doesn't really work, because it's about relationships. This is all about relationships. Relationships are an ongoing, evolving, continuously building type of things. Any of you are in any kind of spousal relationships, you know that those aren't static things. If they become static, they tend to end. They're dynamic, they're always growing, they're always learning from each other. And that's kind of the same in this work. Have a curiosity to try to understand rather than to persuade. Racialize your voice. Acknowledge who you are. If you're a white person, say I as a white person, because we tend to, in white culture, expect everybody else to, oh, my black friend, my Asian friend, but we never say my white friend, or, we don't tend to racialize whiteness. And we need to verbalize that, to get in the practice of that ourselves when we're talking from our own voice. Brevity, something I'm not always even, good at, but go for honesty, but don't go on and on. I just did a live workshop the other night, and I had to remind them about punctuation as part of a sentence. There's an ending, that type of thing. And then, that you honor confidentiality. And Sonya, I don't know if you want to speak to this again, just to
reiterate that where we are today hopefully isn't where we were yesterday, and will not be where we are tomorrow. So just to keep that in mind as we listen to people's comments. Yeah.
And that the nature of the recording will respect that type of confidentiality. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. We're going to do what we did last time. I still want us to go into the compass. And for some of you that have been on these before, you're starting to get a little bit familiar with this. But we walk into spaces in different places and where we're at in our day, depending on what's been going on, what interactions we've had, what's been going on in life around us. And we tend to, this is the compass that's used by Glenn Singleton from Courageous Conversations About Race, which is, I would suggest you get into any of his writings. They'll be very helpful, particularly as he speaks to elementary and secondary education in particular as context. But he kind of views that we're on a compass, and that, in some sense, we're trying to keep it somewhat level, and that there's four quadrants, four corners to this compass. Sorry, my hand doesn't really suggest that, but that's what we're thinking about. And we come into spaces, different places on the compass. We might be in a believing state that, we really, we're looking at this work from a moral perspective, a moral imperative, or you might be in a thinking where you're like, what's what's the information I need to know about this stuff to get going. Some of you are ready to get moving, get something accomplished, and some of us enter into spaces in a very feeling space, something that's gone on that's evoking our kind of emotive places. So just ask you, we're going to split you into breakout groups again, just to kind of shorten this particular segment, but still give you the opportunity to engage in it. Share your name if you're with people you may not know, and what is your connection to the PTA, and then briefly, share where you're at on the compass today at 7, whatever it is, 7:10, 7:16, where you're at in this specific space, okay? As best as you can, knowing that this is not a perfect exercise, so, all right.
So I've got 4 rooms set up with 3 people in each room, and I'll jump into room 4, and I'm gonna give 4 minutes, and then there'll be 30 seconds to bring you back to the main space. So I'm gonna open all the rooms now.
Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about our own stories, and just before we get to that, I'm going to share a couple things about some data points from history and such. Partly because some of these discussions that we're talking about now have been going on for a long time. Some of that is, in ways that I was totally unaware of, continue to become more aware of. And that's part of, as we look at our own story, which we're going to particularly get into a little bit deeper, a little bit further on, part of that is just knowing the terrain that we've been operating on, that these are not new discussions. Some people want to brand it as new discussions. These have been going on for a long time. In some ways, I'm ashamed that I haven't known about some of these discussions and some of these, initiatives that have gone on in our history as a country, and how that's impacted me. So, and we're going to look a little bit tonight about, I think white responses, and where does this start, and how do we become more aware of this stuff, and what can we do moving forward as a society. So I was looking at this, the president's initiative on race, and it talks about this absence of knowledge and understanding, and I think that's so much at the heart of a lot of our problems, that we don't know everything from knowing about ourselves to knowing our history to knowing the groups that we're operating within, how they have developed, how they've formed. And so I think this absence of knowledge really leads to a lot of our issues, a lot of our problems. Because when we can have a moral understanding, a moral imperative, but good knowledge really helps inform how do we actually take actions. How do we know what is specifically wrong, what is specifically not working, and how do we move forward with that? We have a history here of how racism has impacted our individual acts and behaviors, that there's a willingness to participate in institutions and systems built on racist foundations. And that's a strong thing for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, this, that I participate in racism. And you'll hear a lot of people get very uncomfortable if they're said that they participate in racism, because they may not be a person who has a bigoted spirit about them, that is out, saying nasty things about people and things like that. But the reality is we participate in systems that exist around us. I always say, from my Catholic background, we talk about sweatshop issues. That's a big issue within Catholic social teaching. And I would say most of us contribute to sweatshops around the world, because 98% of the clothing that we wear comes from countries and factories that contribute to oppressed workers in sweatshop conditions. So by the fact that we purchase clothing, whether we're knowingly or not, we participate inadvertently in sweatshop issues. You can find a lot of examples like that. We buy strawberries 24/7, 365 days a year. Strawberries used to be a seasonal food. Now we get them from all around the world, from farm areas that, again, use exploited labor and things like that. So we have a complicity in that by our purchasing power. So I think racism operates in a very similar way. We participate in the legal system, in the labor markets, in welfare. How do we define medical systems? All these things are part of the system that we operate in. And I think the first time I heard the white club, that kind of gave you that like a country club kind of connotation, which really comes from a sense of privilege. So, and how aware are we of how these systems operate around us and how we participate in those, even unknowingly, not with malintent or anything like that. In some ways, it's almost impossible. For some of these systems, it's impossible for people of color and for disability people and for people of all areas of where that deal with oppressive systems also have to participate in those systems, because that's just how we're set up. So it's something that is really pervasive and not always necessarily around one's intent or intent of malice. And this is one of the areas that I'm always hesitant to talk about, but racism affects white people. It impacts how we operate in the world. And this is W. Du Bois, even talks about it as early as 1920, of having pity for people in prison and enthralled, hampered and made miserable for such a cause, for such a fantasy. That we, for I as a white male who participates in racism, I hurt myself. I hurt my own sense of humanity, my own sense of the ability to love. I deny the fullness of who I could be by participating in something. So why do I do that? Why do I do something that I know harms me, from that aspect, let alone harm somebody else? Because, when we're thinking about our schools, we want all our children to move forward, to excel and be the best that they can. And the more that they're able to do that together, the better it happens. If we elevate any one group more than the other, then there's a disparity. So, this is a communal thing that we're involved in. And there's a psychological stress on people. There's a disparity between what I might say I believe and do and what I actually engage in, the practices that I actually engage in. And how does that impact me? Let alone, the psychological impact that it, has on groups that are on the receiving end of, oppressive actions and, policies and stuff that malign. So this is something that impacts all people in a negative manner. And so I think it's something as a white person, I have to, explore, what's my complicity in that? How does, what's my own development around these issues so that I can both be a more human person to others, but also be more human to myself, at the same time. And that's not a bad thing, because I'm white. I can't do anything about that. I'm not ashamed of being white, but I also have to be mindful of how being white is complicit to the systems that I operate in. I can't do anything about how I look. This is how I am. This is how, in my sense, God made me. But I have a responsibility to how this operates in culture and what is the impact that I have on other people based on who I am as a white cisgender male in the United States. And I talked about kind of a moral and psychological, and in Christian settings, we talk about racism being America's original sin. So it's, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at this particular, issue of who we are. Okay. So, there are moral ways to look at this issue. Again, the conflict between what our ideals are in this country, what we say are ideals. And you look at the dates on these, this is back in 1944, 1963. These are discussions that have been going on for a while, pre-segregation, about, how do we resolve this conflict between our stated ideals, particularly as a country, and you see this with. I just saw there's a Catholic bishop in Massachusetts that wants a Catholic school to take down a Black Lives Matter flag because he doesn't feel that's consistent with Catholic teaching. And I'm like, what in his mentality says that Black Lives Matter is inconsistent with Catholic teaching? How do we resolve, to what extent do we go to kind of create these type of discrepancies between what our stated values are and what our actions are? So one of the things I think that hurts us is that white people, we tend not to see ourselves as white. What does that mean? What does whiteness mean? So I think that's an ongoing issue of how do we begin to tackle kind of this system that we operate in, and it's a way for us to deny our responsibility in this area. I'm going to show you a little video. Some of you may have seen this before, but I think it kind of shows how white dominant identity often operates. I love this clip because it's just kind of, one, it cracks me up, and two, I just think it kind of lays out some of in very stark ways. Satire, I love satire, and it gets harder and harder to use humor in some of these conversations in a way that is acceptable, but I think it can be a very good way to embrace some of these discussions. And I'm going to bring some more in a little bit. So when we think about racism, and particularly when we think about our stories, it's an early onset thing. It hits us very early. Studies have shown that kids, as early as age 4, start to have ideas around, prejudices instilled upon them. Negative racial attitudes found amongst first graders, white first graders, talking like 6-year-olds. That there's a preference for being white, and the negative attitudes of white children towards Blacks, not based on any kind of direct negative contact, but just on the subtle communications from parents, teachers, media, and others. And I think that's a powerful thing for us to be mindful of. It. How are our kids being impacted, even by the things that we're saying, that even the ways that we've been acculturated that we're even unaware of. What are things that I communicate to my students that I'm unaware of that actually have a bias in them? Phrases I might say, attitudes I might have. And it starts very early for all of us. And just, and these are just a few tidbits of information. The studies are numerous that, talks about how bias shows up in our settings and in our educational systems and things like that. So how aware are we? Something happens at a very young age. It has an intellectual impact on us. How do we teach our students? How are they intellectually prepared? What's their sense of history? I live in Texas, where I often talk about Texas history or mythology. I get the two confused sometimes, because how history is told. The comic on the right is one I use a lot on my exams, just to talk about nativism. And does anyone get the one on the right? I'm just curious. I just spent a week with my mom showing her Far Side cartoons where she just cannot get the humor at all. So I need somebody to get my humor for one time. So the implication is, if animals or fish actually spoke, what language would they speak in? English, right? That's the nativism. That's the normativity of U.S. culture, where our assumption is that even if animals spoke or understood language, it would be in the English language and not in another language. And that's kind of how we really view the world. That's that one sense of nativism and white kind of cultural normativity that happens. And think of the impact on students, where businesses, are looking for, it's been pretty much, affirmed within the business setting that the more diversified their employees are, the more creativity that's allowed, the more expression that's allowed, the better productivity is. And if we have a world where, we kind of narrowly put people into boxes and really stifle that inclusive excellence that is potential, and we harm ourselves culturally, economically, morally, on so many levels that we harm ourselves. So just one of the things that was in the topic was a racial biography. I'm going to jump forward here. Okay. So before we get to that, I was reading back in 1970, the United States had a Commission on Civil Rights, and this was something that was initiated by President Johnson at the time. And it came up with 10 things that could be done. And I wanted to take a look at them. And these are things, one, again, this is something that happened in 1970 that I just recently became aware of. And, why? And then I'd be curious, as you read through these, how you might update some of these if they need updated. So one is, make a commitment to become informed about people from other races and cultures. If it's not your inclination to think about race, commit at least one day each month to thinking about it. I would probably bump that number up a little personally, to maybe one each day, but that would be me. Make a conscious effort to get to know people of other races and backgrounds. And I think in all these conversations, you can, I think race is essential, but I think you can also, around areas of LGBTQ, disability, all the different areas where we can marginalize people. I think you can apply a lot of these approaches in a lot of different ways. And really, it's kind of moving out of your self-isolation. Making a point to raise concerns about comments or actions that appear prejudicial, even if you're not the targets of these actions. Initiate constructive dialogue within your workplace, school, or neighborhood, or religious communities. These are things that take some a large amount of intentionality, a lot of self-preparation to be able to walk into spaces and have the courage to do these things, the ability to listen, to hear what's going on, and the willingness to, again, get back to that discomfort we talked about earlier. How do we support institutions that promote inclusion? How do we help to reduce racial disparities? How do we insist that institutions teach us about our community accurately, that reflect the diversity of our nation? That's a battle that's ongoing right now in many states. I live in Texas. That's a real issue. Florida, it's a real issue. We're seeing that in a lot of states. Ironically, a lot of the states that are struggling with this were also states that dealt with issues of segregation and lynching and things like that. So you can make a correlation or not. That's something to think about. This ninth one, visit areas of the city or region or country that allow you to experience other parts of cultures. beyond their food. You know, I work on college campuses, and I kind of get concerned when our only approach to diversity is what I call the food and fun approach, where we all eat, and there's nothing wrong with eating, and that's a good way to start conversation, but it can be a very passive way to not actually be in dialogue and communication and conversation with people. I live in the city of Austin that's very segregated, and people from the west side do not visit the east side of the city, and vice versa. And just one little half-hour trip will take you from some wealth that is unimaginable to some economic disparity that almost borders it's poverty. And you can do that in a very short day trip, and there are people that have never made that trip, have self-isolated. So I just thought it was interesting that these have been around for 50 years, and we've had a lot of information available to us that we could access, and that we could have been using and utilizing. The main thing we're going to talk about tonight was a racial biography, because I think for all of us, regardless of what our background is have we started to do a deep understanding of who we are, how we've been acculturated the way we are, what's in our history. And this takes some memory, because it's not like we always can, we're always thinking about what happened in second grade or when we were 3 or whatever like that. It takes an intentionality to think about what are the things that impacted who we are, and where we are today in the space that we're at today. And while I call it a racial autobiography, and again, this is something I was exposed to through courageous conversations about race and Glenn Singleton's group, Pacific Educational Group. I also think that it could also be used to address your orientation towards other groups, such as around gender norms, sexual identity, disability areas and stuff. I think all these things can be included. But I found this to be a very helpful personal tool to get started on a personal level. I think probably we all would like to see systemic things happen in our particular, PTAs and regions and stuff like that. And that is a very localized work that has to take place. And you have people in your locations that know your particular context, in your particular PTA, your particular communities. And that work, really has to begin in those particular areas. But each of us as individuals can start on this, kind of looking at our own way we've been brought up, in a sense. So I'm just going to go through the different aspects of it and ask some contributions when we get to each of the topics, just to see if anybody's willing to maybe share what they might put into that particular topic, and go from there. And that's be the bulk of what we're going to do this evening for the rest of our time. So one of the things that you can do is photos tell a big part of your background, and I realize I have a typo in there with a swear word, so I'm going to have to change that. So I apologize for that. But we can create a photo history of who we are and how that impacts us. So this is a little bit about my photo history. Starting to look at my childhood, college, my family, my friends. And as I've been thinking through, these photos have, elicited memories that I hadn't thought of. This upper left-hand one, as I think about myself as a white male, we're on a family vacation in Gettysburg, and this is Devil's Den, which was a place, a location in the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War, where sharpshooters were shooting at each other. And I'm the little boy on the right-hand side. Can anyone see what I'm holding? I know it's a small picture, but Can anyone see what I'm holding? I'm holding a Confederate flag. I'm from Pittsburgh, which was like one Union territory. So why am I holding a Confederate flag? So I'm wondering, like, so I have to go back into my history and find out what was I being exposed to at the time that I was enamored by the Confederacy and not the Union, and what kind of stories or what kind of exposure was going on in my life that's what that's the flag I wanted to hold, and not the Union flag. Um, the picture next to is my sister and my brother and I. When we were at a very young age, I'm probably about 4 in that, about 5 in that picture, and I have to think about where was I living at the time, what was the community that my family lived in. The lower left hand is my grandmother and my grandfather. They were immigrants from Sicily. I love the dress that they're in, for the time period, 1915s or somewhere around there. My college, there's a crest there at the top, that's my fraternity. And then there's a fraternity for one of the historically Black fraternities, Phi Beta Sigma. And the reason that's in there is because they started a chapter at my college, and I remember not understanding why there was an all Black fraternity. Why didn't they just join a regular fraternity? That was my mindset at the time. So I have to think through that. That's part of my history. And that still comes into play when I'm in certain settings, particularly when I'm in a large community of Black people who they talk about their fraternities in ways that I never experienced about my own fraternity. And I feel an interior jealousy even. So I have to process that. What is it about the community of their fraternity that's different than in mine? So those are the things I have to process. That's that discomfort that I have to make note of. So pictures can really help you to start thinking about how you were developed. What are the influences in your life? What was going on that in your culture, or in your particular setting. So what was your first encounter or understanding concerning race would be another category to start in a biography. For most of us, a lot of us, we haven't really thought about when was that first understanding, that first memory. Just a thumb of hands, who knows when they can, who can identify their first encounter or first understanding concerning race? For some of us, it's very immediate. For others, we're not sure. We're thinking about it. When was it? So that's something for us to explore. And what was that first encounter? How does that stay with us, maybe, in ways? And so you would write this down. You would record this. And actually, I'm going to give Sonya a template for this. And I have it as I started as a PowerPoint. Now I keep a journal, a written journal, because the PowerPoint's getting too big. So I keep a journal, and I write down these memories as they come up and try to elaborate on them and detail them. So thinking about the messages that you heard, events you experienced, rules of behavior that were taught to you growing up. Those are very important things. I remember the day I was thinking, like, I was always told, keep my cotton picking hands off of things. That's a phrase that, it's like, don't mess with something that doesn't belong to you. And it didn't dawn on me till much later, like, what's the reference of cotton picking? And that would be, there's a racial, connotation to that. Those are things that, you don't even think about maybe until it's, and then all of a sudden, it's like right in your face. So tracking those things, particularly the things that were a part of your childhood. You know, where were you able to go? You know, what friends were you allowed to hang out with? Whose house were you allowed to go to, and whose houses weren't you allowed to go to? Those type of things. I was just talking to a friend of mine, and we were talking about our elementary school, and that she was not allowed to go to a friend of ours that was a Black girl, and never really understood why. So we were trying to unpack, you know, what was behind that at the time. You know, what was going on with her parents or in our particular community that would lead to that. How do movies, TV, and other forms of media and social media impact your development around race, beginning as early as you can remember, both good and bad? And again, these things are not so much about to find the worst in you, but just how you've been acculturated, positively or negatively. And in a world of social media, you can see how imperative this is even more with young adults, but also in our own. I've been watching a lot of Westerns lately, and old Westerns, and the story of a lost cause, how much that pops up, and how in Westerns, the former Confederacy soldiers are always glamorized, and the Northern soldiers were always vilified. So I'm like, wow, you know, and I that's all I watched when I was a kid. Can anyone else think, or can you think of something in the media that you realize maybe impacted you negatively about race, and it dawned on you one time? Anybody have a thought about that and might want to share that? There's an interesting movie that was made right after the war called Go for Broke. And it was about the 100th Division that fought in Germany, and they were Nice. And the whole movie's purpose, I think, was to combat all the stereotyping of Japanese going into the war, where we needed to create an enemy. And now they were an economic partner, and you know, and it's just fascinating how it tries to you know, kind of reshift the narrative and things like that. You know, yeah. We had a Grease party for a friend of mine watching the movie Grease. That is the most misogynistic movie I think I've ever seen. Now I never remembered it being that way when I watched it as a kid and when it first came out, but watching it now, I'm like, oh my, it is the most misogynistic movie I think I've seen. So, yeah. So, you know, it's something to think about, like what are those media and those things that impacted us, you know, each of us as we grew up, and how does that sit with us, stay with us? How did it impact us in very subtle ways? And how can we, how do we deconstruct that? And how's that, you know, particularly as we work with young adults, you know, what's the role of social media in shaping, you know, the narrative for, you know, the kids in our world? You know, kind of scary actually. How do we, you know, enter into education? How does that impact it? You know, our training. How do we look at discovery and resolution, and you know, how do we do problem solving? And what type of education was it? I ended up going to a very a private college that was, you know, definitely impacted how I viewed the world. You know, I came from a very working class family, and I was in this setting with people wearing Oxford shirts and tweed jackets and things like that. And I drank the soup, and I still have a tweed jacket in my closet that, you know, has nothing, you know, was purely about me wanting to be something that others presented to me as being normative. So looking at those type of things, how do those educational settings impact your development? And you particularly, you know, you see the the discourse today between technical school and vocational training. I'm one who likes to speak about those as higher education. We've done a very big disservice in this country about types of education and classifying one as better than the other, and the stories that, and the narratives that go along with that, how we marginalize people based on the type of education that they pursued and, got involved in. You would ask yourself, what's the most recent occasion in which race relations, or racism impacted your personal thinking, social actions, or being? So this would be something that you would record in this biography. Again, this is an ongoing thing because each day is new, and memories are going to come up. I remember I was in a school a couple of weeks ago and just thinking about, I had some students of color in my classroom, and I know in my head, I was trying to decide, am I favoring them because I'm trying to compensate? Am I ignoring them? It was something that was in my thinking, and I had to wrestle through that. And why is it even in my thinking? Why am I viewing any student differently than others? All those kind of questions that are going on in my head, and impacting how I'm thinking and acting in the moment. Each time, these things come up, we record those things and track it and see how, what's that ongoing narrative in our head. How does race impact your social environment, the settings that you're in? Have you evaluated, where do you go? Who do you hang out with? What settings do you go? What type of restaurants? What type of, settings are you in? What part of town do you, what parks do you go to? Just really kind of doing that ongoing assessment about, where do you find yourself? What kind of spaces do you find yourself in? Because it's very easy to get very comfortable in kind of a static way of doing things, without even thinking about it. And again, it's not intentional. It's just something that often happens. In COVID, I think we're seeing the impact of that even more, of how that has really moved us into kind of isolated and kind of static environments. And so we're all learning how to re-engage with people and move out of our areas that we've kind of been stuck in some ways for about 2 years. And how do we very intentionally break down that kind of structuring that we've had? How do your feelings and attitudes and engagement with race evolved over the span of your life? Thinking about that, what are the memories that you have, and how have things changed for you? How do they continue to change, positively or negatively? Again, and what was going on at the time, that might have impacted that. What has helped shift it one way or the other, and are you aware of that? And then what's the next step or stage you need to take in understanding how race, what it is and how it impacts you? Again, this is that ongoing assessment. So it's this process of really trying to track how you have evolved, where you are at this point. And this is something that, regardless of your background, I think is something beneficial, because we all operate within the system, whether we're in the whether I'm a white male or you're a person of color, we all operate in the same system, and it impacts us negatively or positively on both. And how do we keep track of how we have developed within this culture? Because the more we're mindful of that, the more we can see how, one, we may by default revert into that. I always say, when we're tired, stressed and stuff, we go to our defaults, kind of our default way of doing things. And unless we're mindful of that, it's very easy to go there. The example I give is my boss, who's from Boston. He was an Irish Catholic priest from Boston. I can always tell when he's been home or when he's tired, because he reverts into his Boston accent when he's tired, you know, because that's his default. He's got this accent, and I know when he's tired, because he doesn't always use that. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's just that when we're tired, we kind of go to what is, you know, what our default way of looking at things are. And for me as a white male, my default is still looking at things as a white cisgendered male. And I have to be very intentional about viewing things differently, and how am I entering into spaces, how am I reacting to people, how is it impacting where I'm at on the compass. And the more I know about my history, the more, and how I've been acculturated, the more I can get out in front of some of those things, recognize when things are popping up, when new things pop up, new memories come up. Because as I think about my history and my family, my narrative has changed a lot. If I shared you my racial biography, I went from a person who thought my family was very inclusive because it grew up across the street from a Black family, and we used to do family reunions together, to, you know, ability to hear the subtle messages that they were the good ones, but they weren't the others, you know, and those were very subtle messages that I, you know, picked up. And had I not been, you know, I'm not doing my own work, I might miss those subtleties, because this stuff is very subtle in a lot of how it operates. So that's you know, that's a tool I would share with you, is if you're looking for something you can start doing in your own life. This is, you know, starting on this kind of biography of yourself. And the reality is, it's very similar to doing, you know, assessments of institutions, you know, and, you know, how institutions operate, what are the things that have impacted them, doing, you know, kind of an equity scorecard that some of you might be familiar with. The similar processes that we do as individuals, we could start also doing, you know, in our institutions and organizations that we belong to, and how, you know, and how they have operated historically, and therefore how can we, you know, what kind of changes can we make and such. That's kind of what I had for you tonight. So I don't know if you had any thoughts or reactions to that, or might see how this might be a useful thing for you, or if someone's maybe done something like this similar. One I always share with my students is, particularly growing up in Pittsburgh, is Speedy Gonzalez cartoons. Because I never grew up around Latinx culture growing up that I remember, that I can remember, until I moved to Southern California, and how those cartoons influence how I thought about Mexican American culture. You know, and those types of early cartoons really can have an impact, you know, in very subtle ways that are very, you know, and because they're cartoons, sometimes parents think they're all right because they're cartoons. How could they be harmful? You know. So, yeah.
Didn't they get rid of Pepe Le Pew for that reason too recently? Like, right? I know a lot of people were outraged and started yelling about cancel culture, but you know, certain things should be canceled, I think, you know.
Yeah.
A character that pursues a woman, or, you know, a female, a cat, I guess she was, doesn't take no for an answer. Come on.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Pretty misogynistic, you know.
Yeah, slightly.
Yeah. No, and as you start this process, so it can be a little bit, I don't want to say overwhelming, but like, as you really start to see some of the messages, and like how were they missed, you know, and what was going on in culture at the time, and even today, you know, where do these type of things still pop up, and the whole conversation of cancel culture and all that. Oh my Lord.
how do you get people to see themselves as white if they're not willing to see themselves as white?
It, it definitely evokes an emotional response by people because, we could, we go to our worst thing. Oh, they think we're a bad person is where, people are going. The thing that really that started opening that up for me was two exercises. One was the Horatio Alger thing that's very similar to Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Knapsack of White Privilege. I think that article is still something that I, try to put in front of people in some way or another. If I don't, just handing somebody an article doesn't necessarily do anything, but how can you talk to somebody within their particular context? And for them to recognize in their particular sphere how some of these things emerge. How do they experience some form of privilege in their particular sphere? Because you really have to bring it back to a person's particular context for them to really, see it and get that aha moment. And I'll be honest, a lot of times, when I'm talking about this stuff in a class, I'll start with gender sometimes first, if it's a mixed class, because I know that regardless of on the female side of what their ethnic or racial background is, they will get the gender part of it, and so I kind of build some allies in a sense, but how do you bring it back to a person's particular context? And I think that's the trick. And again, that takes being willing to listen to that person, to appreciate that person is a human being, and not demonizing that person, but humanizing that person. And I had a student who had a poor opinion of Mexican American men. She was a white student from Dallas. She grew up in a very homogenized neighborhood as far as, and the only Mexican American men that she ever saw were some roof workers that were working on the house next to her that were catcalling her when she was, in the backyard, or she'd gotten some, 2 or 3 experiences as a woman, from Mexican American males. So she projected that upon all Mexican American men. And it wasn't until she came to St. Ed's and was playing soccer. She was on the soccer team, and a lot of her teammates were Mexican American. She got to meet their fathers, their brothers, and got to see a different context of, of that. And it contrasted her previous experience. So it had to be something that's very contextualized in somebody's own experience. So that's something I try to do, is to bring it back to that person's experience. That way it's their own self-revelation in a sense, as opposed to me telling them this is the category that you have to buy into, whether you like it or not, whether you get it or not. It's more of like, oh, I didn't realize, I never really saw that in my own experience. And just that little nudging. I did this, I was on a 8-day silent retreat, and my retreat director was trying to understand why I was reading the Christian Hebrew scriptures from a lens of privilege and power. And he started asking me about, what about Black entitlements, and what about why aren't Black leaders doing enough in their community? They should be doing more in their community. And first of all, I was on a retreat. I wasn't there to have a political discussion about racism. But I asked him, what are the Black leaders that you know and that you are in relationship with? What have they told you about their experience around racism? What have you asked of them? And in reality is he didn't have any relationships with any Black leaders in his community. He hadn't learned anything from that. And that stuck with him. So I put it back into his own experience, and he started to think about I don't know any Black leaders. I don't, I need to be more intentional about that, so I put it back into their realm, and he had an aha moment. So that's a long worded answer. Sorry, I can be very wordy sometimes. So I'm not sure if that was helpful at all. But, yeah, but I think the Peggy McIntosh thing is, I think, such a powerful tool to use, particularly for people who just haven't really thought about this. If there's ways to put it in front of them. I have a similar one that actually talks about Christian privilege as well, in a very similar kind of format. When you talk about the school calendar really privileges people that are of the Christian tradition versus other religious tradition, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, and people don't really think about that. And sometimes it's it's not a big jump once they realize it, but then once you're like, yeah, I never really thought that the calendar favors a certain religious tradition. I just thought about it's vacation time. No, we're getting kind of close to our stopping time. Sonya, did you have an exit plan?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
No, it's all right.
Just wanted to share some, first of all, let's thank Jim. I don't think we've ever formally thanked Jim, but let's thank Jim for leading us through this workshop series. I certainly appreciate his willingness to spend so much time with our group and share all that he's learned with us. So I want to formally say thank you to Jim for helping us work through these. So I mentioned during our native land acknowledgement that we are on the land of the Ganondagan tribe. And so I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but we do have a Ganondagan historical site in Victor, which going through these workshops is, prompted me to think about, and Jim talked about last time in allyship about, it's more than just saying the land acknowledgement, but it's taking the time to actually, learn about the people and find out more about the culture. So what I'm in the process of doing, and I'm sorry, I don't have it set up to give you like an announcement tonight, but what I am in contact with the Ganondagan historic site is about setting up a tour that we could do on a Saturday in May. They do charge admission. I think it's $6 for adults. They have a 10-person minimum for a group tour. So it's most likely gonna be on a Saturday in May, just before, we get into really the summer and everybody's, calendars get really crazy. So I'm going to work on a date and I will publicize it and we'll pre-sell tickets to anybody. It would be open to anybody in the region that wants to attend. And I think it's a 2-hour tour. They do have, they have a bark longhouse that is available to tour, and they have a museum, they have a cultural film that they do as part of a tour. So I'll share that opportunity with everybody that's here. But if you want to look at the site yourself, it's ganondagan.org is the website. And then I also happen to notice that our own Rochester Museum and Science Center is actually hosting Haudenosaunee Days on April 30th and May 1st, which is just coming up in a couple of weeks. So if you happen to go to the Rochester Museum and Science Center on that weekend, it's going to be taking place throughout the facility. So that's another opportunity that if you're available and want to go learn more, you can see scheduled presentations and art demonstrations and things like that. And they're going to have some special collections out from storage. So but this is an opportunity for those of us that are local that want to that are available, that want to take part. That's available. And then the last thing that I wanted to do, make a pitch for our Genesee Valley Spring Conference that's coming up on May 11th. This is our annual business meeting. So we need to get a quorum there, like you and your units need to get quorum for your regular business meetings. So we are planning a dinner event on May 11th. So we have early bird tickets available. It's going to be a full dinner, and we're going to recognize our region award winners from 2021 and 2022, as well as elect our officers. We have to renew our bylaws, receive our audit report, all the fun stuff that units and regions need to do on an annual basis. So just wanted to promote the spring conference too. So, and spring conference, you just have to be a PTA member. You don't have to be an officer to attend spring conference. Each unit has a certain number of voting delegates that they're allowed based on everybody's allowed, I think, at least one, and then it's in increments of 50, or at least one or two, and then you have increments of for every 50 members, you get one more delegate. So, yeah, so it's open to any PTA member, current PTA member in our region. So we are in the process of putting together all the videos from this presentation. So thank you to Gary Elling, who's doing that for us. Our region tech person is going to be putting together all the videos, and we'll be releasing those probably sometime in May or June. But we've been updating our online event page with all the links and slide presentations that Jim has been sharing with us over these past 4 sessions, along with some other resources. And I think the plan is Gary will be migrating that from the online event page to maybe a separate section of our region website. So that'll be available for people moving forward. So, but certainly want to thank everybody for being a part of these past 4 sessions. And I hope I've learned a lot. I hope you've learned a lot. And let's continue to think about these topics and continue to write in our journals and think about these things and discuss them within our spheres of community. So thanks, everybody.